All right, everyone. So we're into area of study 2 now, and we're focusing more on the body systems now, mainly of animals, but we'll touch on plants really briefly as well. And the first topic is basically learning about the body systems, which is a lot of review from way back in year 8. Okay, so today is all about the concept of cells to systems, how living things organize their whole body into systems, essentially. So here's the study design link. And the learning intention is that cells are organized into tissues and then organs and then systems. So your success criteria are you should be able to define those 4 key words and then use examples to compare the concepts of cells and tissues and organs and systems. So we're going to start with a bit of a story, and we're looking at these little animals called sponges. So you can see they come in a few different forms. There's a more round one here, and they also come in these little tubular forms that look a bit like a coral. So sponges are one of the first groups of animals to evolve, and they have a really simple level of organization. And they're also in the phylum Porifera, if you remember. Kingdom, and then phylum is the next level of classification down. So sponges are so simple, they actually don't have tissues. So their cells are just basically arranged in blobs of cells, and they're not specialized any further to make tissues or organs. And we're going to have a look at this video in class time, but essentially you can pass a sponge through a sieve and break apart all its cells into individual little cells, and they'll still reform and make the whole sponge again, which obviously couldn't happen with a human. But for sponges, they're so simple that their cells will just reform and they'll build that whole body again naturally. All right, so this is the main concept for this section. It's the idea that every living thing arranges its cells into tissues, and then tissues are arranged into organs, and then organs are arranged into systems, which is shown in this little flowchart here. So the reason that tissues, organs, and systems have evolved is it so that they can perform specific functions, which helps the whole organism to survive. It's much more efficient to have a digestive system and a separate nervous system because they can each specialize on one particular job to help that organism stay alive. So here's a flowchart of an example. We've got a cell here which looks like a muscle cell. It's part of this tissue, and then that tissue is part of this organ, which is the stomach, and then the stomach organ is part of the organ system, which is the digestive system, and then that's part of the whole organism, which is obviously the top level. Okay, let's talk about each of those different levels, beginning with cells. So we don't need to talk much about cells. We've had a whole topic about them. So we all know cells make up organisms, and every organism has to be made of at least one cell. So the cell, a good definition is they're the smallest independently functioning unit of organisms. In other words, they're the building blocks that make up an entire organism. Whether it's just a single-celled organism, or if it's multicellular and it's made of millions or billions of cells. Okay, so cells make up tissues, which means tissues are formed by groups of cells, and we're talking similar types of cells. And all of those cells act in a coordinated manner. They help each other to perform a common function. So when we get to tissues, all those cells have finished specializing. They've been created by some stem cells, they've finished specializing, and now they've got a job to do for their entire life as a cell. So here's a typical example. We've got some nerve tissue here. We've got a nerve, which is an organ. It's made up of nerve tissue. So these little bundles here are bundles of nerve tissue. And then if we zoom into those bundles of nerve tissue, we've got individual nerve cells, which if you remember from year 9 are called neurons. Okay. There are 4 different types of tissues that make up every single mammal. So we're being specific here to the mammal group. Other groups have slightly different tissues, but we need to know these 4. So if you want to build a mammal, you can use all these 4 building blocks to make every organ and every system that you need. We've got epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are on the outside or the inside of surfaces. And they're normally a thin sheet of cells. So you can see some typical epithelial cells up here. They look a bit like scales on a reptile. Muscle tissues are another type of tissue. As we know, muscles contract and relax, so they enable movement. Vital for an animal because animals need to move around and hunt for their food to be able to survive. The third type of tissue in mammals is connective tissue. As the name suggests, connective tissue joins organs together or joins tissues together and provides structural support as well. The last one is nervous tissue, which we looked at in the example before. It's made of nerve cells. There's quite a few different types of neurons. And the whole point of nerve cells is to send high-speed messages throughout the body, because every animal needs to sense its surroundings and respond to them quickly so it can survive and hunt for food and communicate with other animals. All right, going back to our friends the sponge. So sponges don't have specialized cells, and that means tissues have to have evolved after them. So here's a look at what we call an evolutionary tree or a phylogenetic tree. Which essentially is a tree showing how things evolved over time. So we can see at the very bottom here, we've got the sponges in the phylum Porifera. So they evolved first. They evolved way back in time, 500 million years ago when animals were first evolving. They've got really simple tissue, they have really simple body, and they don't have specialized tissue. So we can show that on the evolutionary tree by showing that tissues evolved here, which means every species that evolved later, every one of these groups, has tissues in it. So the jellyfish are some of the first animals that actually have specialized tissues and organs. All right, here's a whole lot of examples of those 4 different types of tissues. So you don't need to memorize them all, but let's have a look at some examples of each one. So epithelial tissue, you can find it in places like the outer layer of our skin, which is the epidermis, the lining on the inside of our mouth and our nose, and the lining on the inside of our digestive system as well. Muscle tissue, anywhere that involves muscles that can move. It's classified into 3 different types. So smooth muscle, we can't control. It's found in the inner linings of our organs, particularly the digestive system. Skeletal muscle is the muscles that we can move. So they're the ones attached to our bones and to our main limbs, and we can control our skeletal muscles. And cardiac muscle is the 3rd type. It's a specialized type of muscle that never gets tired, and it's only found in the heart. And obviously our cardiac muscle contracts for our entire life, from the second it starts beating as an embryo all the way until our last day alive. Those cardiac muscles are constantly in action. Connective tissue joins things together, so bones and cartilage, and people don't often think about it, but blood and fat also count as being connective tissue as well. They're joining different parts of the body. Nervous tissue is obviously the thing that makes up our nerves. So they're made of nerve cells, and they make up the brain and the spinal cord in particular. All right, let's zoom up to the next level again. So cells make up tissues and tissues make up organs. So an organ, it's a group of different kinds of tissue that are grouped together into one structure, and that structure has a specific function. So all the tissues work cooperatively to help that organ do what it needs to do. And organs are the classic parts of our body that we normally talk about as a whole unit, like all these different pictures here. So the stomach, the lungs, the brain, the heart. You can probably name most of these organs. And there's quite a few examples down here too, with their function. So the heart pumps blood, the stomach churns and digests our food, The kidneys excrete wastes from our body that contain nitrogen, and the eye obviously is there to help us see by receiving signals. Okay, so to build an organ, we're going to need all those 4 tissue types that we've learnt about. And most organs will have all 4 types. So here's an example of the small intestine, which we'll focus on later on in the topic. For now, we don't need to memorize all these layers, but it's just giving us an example. So you can see here, we've got an epithelium, which obviously is made of epithelial cells. Then we've got some muscle layers further out, and then we've got some connective tissue layers on the outside. And there's also going to be, even though you can't see them, there's nerves running through some of these middle layers as well. And they're made of nervous tissue. All right, well, the last layer is systems. We've got cells, tissues, organs, and then a system is made of organs. It's also called a body system or an organ system, so all these words mean the same thing. So a system's made of a group of organs, and their job is to carry out a single function that helps keep that organism alive. Like I mentioned earlier, they're specialized to do one thing. So the digestive system digests our food, the nervous system senses and responds to different stimuli around us. A key point to be aware of though, even though every system has a function, they all still work together and they depend on each other. So the digestive system relies on lots of other systems, and that's why if you have a disease that's affecting one system, it's still going to affect most of your body because of how reliant all the systems are on each other. Okay, this diagram is really just to show us how complex all those relationships are. So we don't need to memorize it, but you can see we've got the digestive system, respiratory, circulatory, and urinary. And all of these systems are relating and relying on each other. Plants also have tissues, organs, and systems as well. So animals is normally our big focus, but plants have evolved in pretty similar ways to organize their bodies to do specific functions. It's pretty simple to remember in plants. They've got a shoot system above the ground, and they've got a root system below the ground. So the shoots include the leaves, the flowers, fruits if they make them, the stems and the trunks as well. And then the roots underground. There's a primary root in a lot of plants, and then there's smaller roots coming off the side called lateral roots, and then there's a whole lot of little root hairs, and they're essentially all different organs. So the shoot system in plants is there to collect sunlight and do photosynthesis, and to grow its fruits and to reproduce using its flowers and its fruits. The root system keeps the plant in the soil and absorbs all the nutrients from the soil that it needs. All right, so we've reached the top level. So we've gone from cells to organs, from cells to tissues to organs to systems, and now we've reached the final level of the organism. So a whole organism, it's a living being, it's made of cells, and it can perform all the necessary functions to stay alive on its own, just like these little animals or some amazing fish here in the Great Barrier Reef. All right, so you should be able to define those 4 key words and use some examples to talk about how they relate to each other.